In 1905, the Japanese Navy did something no one thought possible. They annihilated a European great power at sea and announced to the world that Japan was now an empire to be feared. But rewind just 50 years, and this same country had no modern navy, no factories, no railroads. It was a feudal society of samurai and swordsmiths, sealed off from the entire world. So how does a hermit kingdom of warlords become a global military power within a single lifetime? How do you go from swords to steel? To understand it, we have to go back, way back, 1500 years. This is the story of Japan's transformation. Japan is not an easy place to build a civilization. Four main islands and thousands of smaller ones, stretched across the intersection of four tectonic plates. That means earthquakes, constant ones, tsunamis, volcanoes, hot springs, sure, but also a landscape so mountainous that usable farmland is scarce. Most of the country is peaks and forests, forcing people to cluster in isolated valleys and narrow coastal strips. The sea is everywhere, and from the beginning, it defined everything: food, transport, and a barrier against the outside world. The first humans walked into this unforgiving archipelago around 30,000 years ago. By roughly 13,000 BCE, they had developed what we now call the Jomon culture, one of the most sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies anywhere on Earth. And these people made pottery, not just basic clay bowls, but some of the oldest and most distinctive ceramic work in human history. Pots with intricate cord-marked patterns, vessels that predate the invention of farming in Japan by thousands of years. Most civilizations invent pottery after they settle down to farm. The Jomon did it the other way around. Around 400 BCE, a new group crossed the sea from mainland Asia, the Yaoi people. They brought three new technologies that would transform the islands forever: rice farming, silk production, and metalworking. The Jomon and Yaoi didn't just fight, they intermingled, their cultures fusing into something new. Farming created a food surplus, and food surplus created population growth. By 300 CE, somewhere between 1 and 4 million people lived on the islands, and by 100 CE, those millions had organized themselves into roughly 100 small kingdoms, each ruled by its own clan. This is where the story of Japan as a unified state actually begins. Out of those hundreds of squabbling kingdoms, one clan rose above the rest, the Yamato, based in the fertile plains of what is now Nara Prefecture. By the 4th century CE, through warfare and alliance building, they consolidated the rival clans into a single kingdom. But conquest alone was not enough. The Yamato needed something stronger than swords to hold their power. They needed a story. The Yamato claimed descent from Emperor Jimmu, a mythical figure who supposedly reigned from 660 to 583 BCE, and through him from Amaterasu, the sun goddess herself. This wasn't just mythology, this was political engineering. If your leader is descended from the sun god, who's going to argue with them? The Yamato clan became Japan's first ruling dynasty, the Tenno. They are the direct ancestors of the current Japanese imperial family, the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy in the world. Their rule expanded across Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. Now, claiming a divine ancestry is a great PR move, but divine ancestors don't really teach you how to collect taxes or run a successful bureaucracy. So the 6th and 7th centuries, the Yamato court did something very smart. They looked across the sea at China and said, "We'll have what they're having." Interactions with China and Korea exploded. Buddhism arrived and fused almost seamlessly with the local Shinto religion, a pattern of cultural blending that would repeat throughout Japanese history. Chinese characters were imported and adapted to the Japanese language, giving birth to the first Japanese literature. In 607, Prince Shotoku, one of the most influential figures of the era, sent a delegation of Japanese nobles directly to China to study. They brought back Confucian philosophy, Chinese art, government models, and the concept of merit-based civil service. It was, in effect, a wholesale import of civilization. Prince Shotoku essentially walked into the Chinese Empire and said, "We'll take the philosophy, the architecture, the writing system, and the political structure, but we're keeping the local gods and the ancestor worship. Call it a fusion menu." And to be fair, it did work brilliantly. For a while. By 710 CE, the capital had moved to Nara, a city deliberately modeled on Chang'an, the grand Chinese capital of the Tang dynasty. Upper-class Japanese adopted Chinese dress, Chinese customs, and Chinese way of thinking. Buddhism was established as the official religion. A new legal code based on Confucian philosophies was implemented. But here's the problem with building a capital city next to the enormously wealthy Buddhist monasteries. The monasteries became politically powerful. They accumulated land, they accumulated influence, and eventually they started to threaten the emperor himself. In 794, the emperor made a tactical retreat. Literally, the capital was moved to Heiankyo, modern-day Kyoto, to escape the grip of the Buddhist clergy in Nara. And it worked, sort of, but the move had an unintended consequence. It strengthened a different set of power players, the noble court families, chief among them the Fujiwara clan. The Heian period, from 794 to 1156, was a golden age of culture, an era of peace, refinement, and staggering artistic achievement. The tale of Genji was written, often called the world's first novel. If you were a noble in Heian-kyo, your biggest concern wasn't a foreign invasion. It was whether the shade of your kimono complemented the season, or whether your poem captured the precise melancholy of autumn leaves. The emperor became a cultural figurehead, a prize to be controlled, while the Fujiwara clan pulled the strings behind the scenes. But while the court was busy writing poems, something was stirring in the provinces. The central government's grip on the countryside was slipping. Land and wealth were handed out to noble clans who grew increasingly independent. The geography that had always defined Japan, those mountains, those isolated valleys now worked against the emperor. It was impossible to keep track of what the provincial nobles were doing, and those nobles, the daimyo, started hiring armed guards, the bushi, the samurai. Originally, the samurai were not the romanticized, honor-bound warriors of legend. They were land managers, armed bailiffs, the muscle. Local daimyo hired them to protect their tax-free estates from the tax-hungry government in Kyoto. But taxes flow uphill, and so does power. Over time, as the daimyo grew richer from crops and trade, and as those samurai became loyal to their local lord rather than some distant emperor they'd never seen, the balance of power tipped away from the capital. In 1156, the clans began fighting, not against the foreign enemy, against each other, over who would control the emperor. Every daimyo picked a side, and as the result, there was a 30-year civil war that ripped the country apart. When the dust settled, in 1185, one family had emerged victorious, the Minamoto, led by a man named Minamoto no Yoritomo. He did something that would define the next 700 years of Japanese history. Instead of ruling through the emperor in Kyoto, he established his military government in Kamakura, a city far from the old court. In 1192, the imperial court, now largely ceremonial, gave him the title Seitai Shogun, the great barbarian subduing general. The shogun was now the real ruler of Japan. In complete control of the government, he appointed administrators to run provinces, managed the taxes, and kept a portion of the revenue for himself. The emperor still sat on his throne, but the shogun held the sword. Under the Kamakura shogunate, Japanese culture became overtly, unapologetically warlike. The samurai class solidified its identity and its code: bushido, duty, loyalty, bravery. Martial skill was placed above all else. And then in the 13th century, the most terrifying military force on earth came knocking. The Mongols, under Kublai Khan, had already conquered China, Korea, and vast swaths of Asia and Europe. They were, by any measure, the deadliest fighting force in human history. In 1274, they launched their first invasion of Japan. The samurai fought bravery and were completely outmatched by the Mongol tactics and technology. Then nature intervened. A violent gale tore through the Mongol fleet, destroying ships and forcing them to retreat. The Japanese believed the gods themselves had intervened. Kublai Khan was not the man who took no for an answer. In 1281, he returned, this time with a force of 140,000 men and thousands of ships, assembling from Korea and China. It was the largest amphibious invasion in world history, until D-Day. The fighting lasted 7 weeks. The samurai held, barely, and then so, as if on cue, a massive storm, a typhoon of legendary ferocity, smashed into the Mongol fleet. Ships were shattered against the coast, tens of thousands drowned. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. The gods had once again protected Japan. But divine intervention comes with a bill. The samurai and the Buddhist priests who had fought demanded 3 months' pay for their service. The shogunate simply didn't have the money. Only the priests were paid. The samurai, the warriors who had bled for the shogun, were left empty-handed. A government that can't pay its warriors is a government on borrowed time. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo challenged the shogun's authority directly. The resulting civil war brought down the Kamakura shogunate. A man named Ashikaga Takuji, originally sent to crush the emperor's uprising, betrayed his shogun and instead threw his support behind Go-Daigo. For 3 years, the emperor ruled. Then in 1336, Ashikaga set up his own shogunate. By 1392, he controlled the entire country. The Ashikaga shogunate was, frankly, a disaster of governance. The shogun directly controlled very little land. He relied almost entirely on the support of daimyo for troops, taxes, and the support was conditional on the shogun's personal ability. Later, Ashikaga shoguns prioritized tea ceremonies, theatre, and landscape gardening over running the country. By the early 15th century, a series of early deaths created a succession crisis of sorts. Natural disasters triggered peasant uprisings. The daimyo, sensing weakness, started fighting each other directly for land and influence. The center, quite frankly, could not hold onto its power. In 1467, a dispute over who would become the next shogun exploded into a 10-year civil war called the Onin War, and almost every daimyo in Japan participated. The fighting was brutal, and in the end completely inconclusive. Neither side gained a decisive advantage, but the Ashikaga shogunate, already weak, lost whatever shred of authority it still had. For the next century, Japan descended into the Sengoku period, the warring states. There was no central government, no national law, and no peace. Daimyo fielded armies of tens of thousands, ninjas operating as spies and saboteurs. Alliances shifted consistently. All the established clans were overthrown by smaller, hungrier rivals. Villages and towns decimated, then rebuilt, then destroyed once again. Over 5,000 castles were constructed across the country, predominantly wooden structures perched on massive stone bases, each one a strategic fortress guarding the surrounding territory. But war, strangely enough, fuels growth. Towns and cities expanded around these castles. Daimyo poured money into infrastructure, land reclamation, irrigation projects, roads. Trade with China blossomed. A new merchant class emerged, wealthy and ambitious. And there were the Iko-Iki warrior monks, groups organized by small villages. They created small armies to protect themselves against bandits and marauding samurai. They protested against the crushing taxes. In 1486, they had done something that never happened before in Japanese history. The Iko-Iki overthrew the governor of Kaga province and took control. For the first time, commoners ruled a province. And then, in 1543, everything changed. Portuguese sailors, blown off course on their way to China, landed on the island of Tanegashima, off the coast of Kyushu. The Japanese called them the Nanban, the southern barbarians. The local daimyo, a man named Tanegashima Tokitaka, saw two objects he had never seen before: muskets. He bought both of them on the spot and ordered his swordsmith to study them, to take them apart, understand the barrel, understand the firing mechanism, and reproduce them. Within a year, the smith had produced dozens of copies. The firearm revolutionized Japanese warfare instantly. It was easy to use, requiring minimal training. Its range exceeded the bow. Its bullets pierced every form of armor in existence. And because Japan was already in the middle of a century-long civil war, demand exploded. Within 10 years, over 300,000 muskets had been manufactured. By the 1590s, roughly 25% of all Japanese troops were using firearms. Japan was producing more guns than any other nation on earth. The Portuguese didn't just bring weapons. They brought trade, porcelain, silk, spices, cloth. And they brought God. Catholic missionaries arrived alongside the merchants, the most important of which was Francis Xavier, who landed in 1549 and earned the title Apostle of Japan. He personally converted 2,000 Japanese. By the 1580s, there were roughly 100,000 Christians in Japan. 6 daimyo in the south had already converted. The city of Nagasaki was handed over to Jesuit control in the 1570s. The lawlessness of the Sengoku period meant there was no strong central authority to block the missionaries. Christian daimyo got provincial access to Portuguese trade, and trade meant wealth, and wealth meant power. Trade with Japan was staggeringly lucrative for Europeans. The Japanese were spending 18 to 20 tons of silver annually on foreign goods. But the Portuguese also engaged in something much darker. Between 1543 and 1595, 700 Japanese were captured and sold into slavery. Into this chaos stepped a man born in 1534 in Nagoya, in Owari province, the second son of the daimyo of the Oda clan, his name Oda Nobunaga. In 1551, he became the leader of his clan. They called him the Demon Daimyo, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. He was ruthless, unpredictable, yet brilliant. He organized his military from top to bottom. In 1549, he ordered 500 muskets for his army, one of the first daimyo to understand what firearms meant for the future of war. He turned his ashigaru, his peasant foot soldiers, into full-time professional soldiers rather than seasonal conscripts. In 1560, at the Battle of Okahazama, Nobunaga did the unthinkable. With just 2,000 men, he defeated an army of 25,000 Imagawa assault warriors. It should have been impossible. It wasn't. Over the next 2 decades, he cut through central Japan like a blade, defeating daimyo after daimyo, forming alliances where it suited him, and betraying those alliances when it didn't. By 1568, he had marched into Kyoto and installed his own puppet shogun. By the 1580s, he had conquered most of Honshu. And then, in 1582, it ended. One of Nobunaga's own generals, Akechi Mitsude, turned on him. Mitsude attacked Nobunaga at a temple in Kyoto, trapped Nobunaga and his son, committed seppuku, ritual suicide. The man who had almost unified Japan was dead, betrayed by one of his own. The news reached a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was fighting the Mori clan in western Japan at the time. Hideyoshi was born in 1537 to a peasant family. He had entered Nobunaga's service in 1538 as a local ashigaru, a foot soldier, but he was noticed for his skills both as a general and a negotiator. He rose through the ranks rapidly, even serving at one point as Nobunaga's sandal bearer. When he heard of Nobunaga's death, he immediately made peace with the Mori clan, marched his army back to Kyoto, and crushed Mitsude's forces at the Battle of Yamazaki. He then took Nobunaga's authority and power for himself. He arranged to be adopted into the Toyotomi clan because a peasant couldn't rule Japan directly. He began construction of the Osaka Castle in 1583, a monumental seat of power. Then he continued what Nobunaga had started, the unification of Japan. He invaded Shikoku, he invaded Kyushu. By 1590, he had subdued the last independent clans in northern Honshu. Japan was, for the first time in over a century, once again, a single nation. However, Hideyoshi had a small problem. He was a peasant. He couldn't take the title of shogun. The social hierarchy would not allow for it, and the daimyo, though defeated, still controlled their own lands and armies. So Hideyoshi launched a series of sweeping reforms to lock in his power. He decreed that all peasants must surrender their swords. Samurai were forced to leave the countryside and relocate to the cities. A massive land survey and census were conducted, which conveniently increased tax revenue. He blamed daimyo from converting to Christianity, forcing European missionaries to leave. He then told European traders they could stay, but only if they stopped trying to convert people. And then, with his armies idle and his business still insecure, he made a catastrophic decision. He invaded Korea. Between 1592 and 1598, Hideyoshi waged war on the Korean peninsula, with the ultimate goal of conquering China. It was partly ambition, partly a way to keep his samurai occupied so they wouldn't rebel against him. The initial invasion was successful. Japanese forces captured most of the country, but then Chinese forces intervened, and the war bogged down into a bloody stalemate. In 1598, the Japanese withdrew. Hideyoshi died the same year, leaving behind an infant heir and a power vacuum. One man was perfectly positioned to fill that vacuum: Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1543, the son of the daimyo of the Matsudaira clan. His life had been defined by suffering and patience. When he was 6 years old, his father was murdered, and his clan destroyed. From ages 9 to 14, he lived as a hostage of the Imagawa clan. He escaped and regained independence only after Oda Nobunaga crushed the Imagawa. He allied with Nobunaga, fought beside him, and had become the second most powerful man in Japan under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man who never fully trusted him. Hideyoshi gave Ieyasu control of 8 provinces in the Kanto region in eastern Japan, deliberately far away from the capital. Ieyasu used that distance to his advantage. He expanded his power, conquered hostile daimyo, and built a base of strength that Hideyoshi could not touch. When Hideyoshi died, Ieyasu moved. On October 21st, 1600, his forces met a coalition of clans loyal to Hideyoshi's younger heir at the Battle of Sekigahara. It was the largest battle Japan had ever seen before the Second World War. Ieyasu won decisively. He became the sole leader of Japan. In 1603, the emperor named him shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate was born. More than a century of civil war was over. His descendants would now rule Japan for the next 265 years. Ieyasu moved the capital to Edo, modern-day Tokyo. This was a strategic masterstroke. Edo was deep within his own territory, far away from the emperor's court in Kyoto. The city centered on Edo Castle, one of the largest fortresses in Japan, housing thousands of samurai loyal directly to Ieyasu. Within 100 years, Edo would become one of the largest cities in the world. Ieyasu reorganized Japan with a single objective: make rebellion impossible. He directly controlled 25% of the nation, the most powerful and wealthiest region, including Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka. The remaining land was divided among approximately 270 daimyo. Peasants were forbidden from leaving their domain without the lord's permission. 5 highways, the Gokaido, were constructed across the country, patrolled by the shogun's troops, enabling the rapid movement of soldiers and the efficient monitoring of the population. And then there was the Sankin Kotai system, alternative attendance. It was diabolically simple. Every daimyo was required to spend every second year in Edo, physically present at the shogun's court. When they returned to their own lands, they had to leave their wives and children in Edo as hostages. The cost of maintaining 2 residences, of organizing these massive annual processions, of supporting a household in the most expensive city in the country, it bled the daimyo dry. Less money meant fewer soldiers, less time in their home provinces meant fewer opportunities to plot rebellion. It was a golden cage, and every daimyo was locked inside. In 1623, the third Tokugawa shogun implemented sengoku, the closed country policy. Japan sealed its borders. No Japanese person could travel abroad without permission. Only one port, Nagasaki, remained open to international trade. Only the Chinese, Koreans, and Dutch were allowed, and the Dutch were restricted to a single small island, permitted to dock once a year. All other Europeans expelled. Foreign books, foreign goods, foreign ideas suppressed. Goal simple: eliminate any influence that might inspire dissent. Christianity was considered the most dangerous foreign idea of all, a religion that demanded loyalty to the Pope, a foreign ruler over loyalty to the shogun. In 1614, all missionaries were expelled. In 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion erupted, a massive Christian uprising in southern Japan. It was crushed with devastating brutality. 37,000 people were beheaded. Afterward, every Japanese person was required to register at a Buddhist temple and prove they were not Christian. The Kakuru Christiani, the hidden Christians, continued to practice in secret, passing their faith down through generations in whispers. The peace Ieyasu built transformed Japan. Between 1600 and 1720, cultivated land increased by 140%. The population surged from 12 million to 31 million. The cities swelled. Edo's population surpassed 1 million by the 18th century, making it the largest city on earth. Rice became both a staple food and the measure of wealth. Samurai's wages were paid in rice, the daimyo ate polished white rice, and the peasants who grew it ate millet. And the merchant class, positioned at the bottom of the official social hierarchy but holding enormous wealth, exploded. The 5 highways made the movement of goods efficient and safe. Sengoku meant zero competition from foreign merchants. Samurai and daimyo were legally forbidden from engaging in commerce, so the merchants grew. And they weren't shy about showing it. Large houses, fine silk clothing, expensive entertainment in the pleasure districts. The shogunate tried to enforce sumptuary laws to keep them in their place, but the laws ignored. The social order was in a fiction, and everyone knew it. The samurai class, the warrior elite, upholders of Bushido, were rotting. By the 19th century, many impoverished. They received fixed wages in rice, but rice prices fluctuated, and the cost of living rose more than their wages. They were forbidden from trading, yet had to maintain a lifestyle befitting their status. Many fell deep into debt to the very merchants they despised. The number of Ronin masterless samurai swelled. They worked as mercenaries, bodyguards for wealthy merchants, and sometimes thugs. Peace, the great gift of the Tokugawa, had rendered the warrior class obsolete. No battle meant no chances for glory. No glory meant no achievement. They were humiliated and restless, looking for someone to blame. The peasants were suffering too. The temper famine of 1833 to 1837 brought widespread starvation. In Osaka, a former police inspector named Oshio Heihachiro watched the shogun's ministers collude with merchants to hoard rice while people starved in the streets. His appeals to administrators were ignored, his petitions dismissed. So in February of 1837, he set fire to his own house as a signal, and mobs of desperate peasants descended on the merchant district, burning warehouses and seizing rice. The uprising lasted 2 days. 3,300 houses were destroyed. The shogun's troops crushed it, and captured rebels were tortured and murdered. The shogun's response was not reform, but repression. More restrictions on foreign trade, more censorship of Western literature. The cracks in the Tokugawa shogunate were becoming more and more visible. And in the outside world, something terrifying was happening. European powers were carving up Asia. Between 1839 and 1842, Britain crushed China in the Opium Wars. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to open its ports, cede territory, and grant Europeans legal immunity on Chinese soil. China, the ancient superpower, the cultural motherland of East Asia, the country Japan had modeled itself on for centuries, had been humiliated by a handful of British warships. The Japanese watched, and they understood the implications. If China could fall, so could they. Japan's military, after 2 centuries of isolation, was obsolete. Its coastal defenses, a joke. On July 8th, 1853, 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay. They were American warships, steam-powered, belching smoke, bristling with cannons. Commodore Matthew Perry had been sent by President Fillmore with a simple mission: force Japan to open to American trade, using force if necessary. Perry delivered a simple letter with 3 demands: free trade between the 2 nations, American steamships should be allowed to refuel in Japanese ports, shipwrecked American sailors treated with kindness. The shogun had 6 months to respond. If he refused, Perry would return with a larger fleet. In February of 1854, Perry came back. 8 ships, 1,600 men. He refused to leave until a treaty was signed. He threatened to bombard Edo from the sea. On March 31st, 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed. The sengoku policy, dead. The ports of Shimoda and Hokkaido were opened to American ships. A permanent American embassy was established. Over the next 5 years, Russia, France, Britain, and the Netherlands signed similar treaties. Foreigners were allowed to reside in Japan, but Christian missionaries returned. Foreign governments gained extraterritorial rights, meaning their citizens operated under their own laws, not Japanese law. The shogun could not impose tariffs on foreign goods. The treaties were, in every sense, unequal. Japan had been forced to surrender its own sovereignty. The humiliation was absolute. The shogun's capitulations shattered whatever legitimacy he had left. The emperor openly opposed the treaties. Public hostility towards the Tokugawa boiled over. Daimyo began rearming. In January 1867, Emperor Komei died, and his 15-year-old son Matsuhito took the throne, taking the name Meiji. Enlightened ruled. He fell under the influence of powerful anti-Tokugawa clans of Satsuma and Chosu. In November of 1867, the shogun was forced to resign, officially transferring power to the emperor. The Meiji Restoration had begun. In 1868, the emperor signed the Charter Oath, a 5-point statement promising a new democratic Japan. But the Tokugawa family did not go quietly. They raised an army and revolted. The Boshin Civil War erupted, pitting Tokugawa loyalists against the emperor's forces. By the end of 1868, the Tokugawa were defeated. The shogunate, after 265 years, abolished. Tokugawa lands were confiscated. What happened next was one of the most rapid societal transformations in human history. The feudal system abolished. Japanese citizens all became equal. The daimyo's lands were reorganized into modern prefectures. Their gardens and parks open to the public. The samurai lost all their special privileges. The civil service was open to everyone. In 1872, elementary school became compulsory for every Japanese child. The same year, the Tomioka silk mill opened with 300 silk reeling machines imported from France. The government hired 3,000 foreign consultants to help reorganize the economy. Telegraph lines, railway roads, factories built at a staggering pace. Western clothing replaced traditional dress. Red meat and bread appeared on Japanese tables. Western art architecture, military organization, all absorbed, adapted, Japanized. The military transformed with terrifying speed. In 1894, Japan went to war with China and won decisively. Taiwan became a Japanese colony. In 1905, Japan did the unthinkable. It defeated the Russian Empire. The entire Russian fleet was destroyed in simply 40 minutes. Europeans who had always viewed Asians as inferior were forced to reevaluate. Japan was invited to sit at the table of great powers. The unequal treaties were rewritten. But the samurai spirit did not die. It was repurposed. Soldiers were now expected to be fanatically loyal to the emperor and to Japan. Surrender was dishonorable. Seppuku was still practiced by some commanders. The Bushido Code that had been forged in the fires of the Sengoku period, that had rusted during the long peace of Tokugawa, was now welded to the machinery of a modern nation state. In the span of a single lifetime, Japan had gone from feudal isolation to industrial empire. It had been forged by geography, unified by myth, torn apart by ambition, rebuilt by terror and brilliance, sealed from the world, and then blasted open by black ships and steam. The story of Japan is not a straight line. It's a cycle of absorption and isolation, of destruction and renewal. And every cycle, every war, every peace, every lockdown, every transformation shaped the nation that would, in the 20th century, shake the world.